June 2026, Nintendo launched the Donkey Kong Challenge. But what exactly is the challenge? What benefits does it bring to Nintendo? Why have they chosen Donkey Kong? And what other properties might follow in the footsteps of the Great Ape? In this video, we're going to deep dive the challenge and what this might mean for the way that Nintendo is going to continue with its development of its classic lineup, as well as looking at where else this thinking might lead them. So first of all, what is the Donkey Kong Challenge? Well, it's exclusive to Switch 2 and to Nintendo Switch Online. It was announced on the 9th of June, which was of course the Direct, but it ends on the 1st of September. So it is limited in time. And if you go on there, there's a split between Donkey Kong Bonanza and Nintendo Classics Donkey Kong games. So it serves both audiences. There are 39 different challenges, and it includes advanced challenges which are labeled as developers challenges, suggesting that this is something where more interested players in the mechanics of games, people who want a greater challenge, could enjoy Donkey Kong specifically. And this is a different positioning, I think, from something like Mario, which is clearly aimed for more of an entry level for most players. Now, what are the benefits to Nintendo of doing this? First of all, it is their equivalent of some kind of achievement system. Many other companies have introduced achievements in different ways, and it's always been the case that Nintendo has not wanted to emulate what other people have done. I have actually suggested in the past some kind of virtual sticker book could be a solution to this, and in many respects, that seems to be what the achievements are. They are collectible reward cards, and it does remind me a little bit of the Super Mario Galaxy movie cards that were used in the Nintendo Today app earlier in the year. Of course, this highlights the Donkey Kong property, which is always good, and it develops Donkey Kong Bonanza, which they want to position as one of their great evergreens. Its sales were pretty good out of the gate, but the recent sales were not as strong, and so if they want to get it to continue to be an ongoing success in the manner of Luigi's Mansion or other similar breakout properties, then they're really going to want to keep pushing it, and this is one way to do so. It also, I would guess, reuses some of the technology, or some of the ideas at least, from Nintendo Today, and it means that the classics library is not just an inert block of games that exist on the Nintendo Switch Online, but it's an active library, something they're continuing to develop. And I think it is something that Nintendo are going to want to continue to do, to exploit that classics library, to keep it alive, to keep it fresh, even after they've put the NES games and the Game Boy games onto the Nintendo Switch Online quite a while ago, up to 10 years ago coming up. It's not the case that they're done with these titles. Think about NES Remix, think about Nintendo World Championships. I think this is a broader push to make sure that these Nintendo classics remain part of the conversation, because I suspect that there is a decent sized audience, and probably a relatively affluent audience, of people for whom these nostalgic kind of games are one of the primary things that they enjoy playing. And so while we consider many other properties in their own right, Animal Crossings and Splatoons, I think there probably is a discrete fan base for the Nintendo classics. Of course, also the experiment will provide them quite a lot of data, and we'll go into what kind of data they might harvest from this in a minute, but I think that is also something which is obviously on Nintendo's mind. So why start with Donkey Kong when there are so many different properties that Nintendo could use? Well, for one thing, there's a relatively even balance of sales between the West and Japan. A lot of other properties are geared one way or another. So I do have a video which will be coming out later in the year which will explore this a bit more, but we know that Splatoon is very Japan focused, whereas something like Zelda and particularly Metroid are very much focused on the non-Japanese audiences. With Donkey Kong, it seems like there's quite a balance, particularly since Donkey Kong Bonanza. It's also quite a large audience, with over 4 million people having installed the game on the Switch 2, and it has a reputation for challenging gameplay, so the idea of a Donkey Kong challenge fits the brand in the same way that a Mario challenge might not. I think it's also a good way to keep their core audience base engaged during a period where there are slightly fewer major games, although of course there are some very significant titles this summer, with Star Fox, with Rhythm Heaven, and now with Splatoon Raiders. So I don't think that's maybe a primary reason for people to keep engaged with the Switch 2, even during periods where perhaps the games that are major AAA titles are not quite appearing over the horizon just yet. We've also got this great cross-pollination between Nintendo Switch Online and Bonanza. There will be people who are keen on Nintendo Switch Online, but who perhaps haven't wanted to try Donkey Kong Bonanza. And so I suppose this is an alternative to a demo. This is a way to get people to become familiar with and therefore potentially interested in the property. And there's a sort of collector's mindset that if you collect all the classics card, you might then think, oh, well, actually, I might like to try Donkey Kong Bonanza and get some of these as well. Also, of course, the contained style of the Donkey Kong Country games and some of the other Donkey Kong titles does suit experimentation with classics in the way that something more open-ended might not. It might be more difficult to do this with Metroid, although I'm sure they've managed it, and clearly they have done with Nintendo World Championships, but you can see how Donkey Kong has a particular appeal in this respect. It also means they're highlighting the diversity of games on Nintendo Switch Online in a way that wouldn't happen if they simply went with Zelda or Mario. And of course, it's going to be much more transparent than Mario what the impact is on the property. There are so many Mario initiatives going on at any one time that if you saw a sales spike, it wouldn't be immediately apparent what was the cause. But with Donkey Kong, they can pretty reliably guarantee that if they put a big push behind something like the Donkey Kong Challenge, and they see an uplift in Donkey Kong Bonanza sales, particularly since they will obviously be able to link people's Nintendo Classics accounts to their sales patterns, well, in that case, they can make a reasonable deduction about whether or not this is an effective way to raise the profile of the title and to promote a series. So, what data will Nintendo try to dig up? Well, I think they can first of all look and see what the take-up is by territory. Now, there are some people who will be particularly challenge motivated. My suspicion is that these will tend to be the older gamers, possibly more male, and I suspect it might actually appeal to quite a number of Japanese players. They'll also be able to identify the demographics of these people, which is going to be very useful if they are looking to launch, for example, a Donkey Kong movie and to advertise to particular people who they might want to bring to the cinema, as well as obviously the general family audience. They can also look to see which of these games are actually prompting longer play sessions, because of course the idea is always to get people onto the Switch 2 and to keep playing and to feel like they're getting value from the console. Well, if they can have titles which people try and then feel like, oh, actually, this is quite interesting, I'm going to want to keep playing it, well, that's going to be a useful title to develop. My hunch is that Ocarina of Time was always a title where Nintendo could see quite transparently that once people played around with it, they ended up playing for quite a substantial period of time. And so it's not just the importance of the game in terms of the Zelda canon, it's not just its great reputation or its great reviews, it's the fact that actually it sticks with people. That means that Nintendo will go back to it a lot sooner than perhaps other titles which are similarly celebrated, but which might not have quite the same prestige for Nintendo. It also will be interesting to see exactly what the Venn diagram is of Donkey Kong Bonanza players and Donkey Kong Country players, since at some point quite soon, I imagine, Nintendo will want to promote Donkey Kong Country or some variant thereof, bearing in mind that the country name is not used in Japan. They might not call it Country, just as they dropped the Chronicles off of Xenoblade for Genesis, but irrespective of what they call it, I think they will want to see if there is an overlap there or whether they're really fishing in quite different ponds. That's not necessarily to say that they won't want to pursue these titles, but it might affect how they budget them, if there's a sense that the Bonanza audience isn't really that interested in the country games, or it might affect how they advertise and promote them. Social media velocity during the challenge period might also be something that they look at. They might look at hashtag trends and such like. I guess this is a relatively low impact thing for Nintendo, but still, if people do get playing Donkey Kong, that's obviously going to be helpful. And yes, the sales velocity during the challenge period will be key, not just the games, and of course it's not just Bonanza, but there are other Donkey Kong Country games available on the Nintendo Switch 2, but also, does it keep people engaged with Nintendo Switch Online? Does it keep the renewals up? That's always something that Nintendo will want to do, bearing in mind that this is now quite a major source of income for them. Okay, so how could this core concept be developed? The obvious thing would be to push it out to other properties, and we'll look at that in a second, but also we should remember that there are lots of venues now that Nintendo has interactions with people and customers. So there's movies, there's games, there's theme parks, there's the museum. All of these places potentially could be used for these kinds of cards, and we already saw that with the Super Mario Galaxy film and the exclusive cards there. If you had check-ins at particular places, that could serve as a glue encouraging people to go from one place to another. And of course, what they could do is actually institute some kind of physical trophies or physical rewards in response to meeting these challenges. I don't think this is something Nintendo would want to do too often, as there is obviously a cost to it, but you could imagine that if there were some kind of major competition, perhaps this would be something more for the Splatoon or Smash crowd. They could have some kind of physical trophy for the first, second and third place, perhaps medals, perhaps participation things for people who have completed a certain amount, and of course that would all be paid for out of the budget for Nintendo Switch Online. Probably the Nintendo Switch Online budget will ultimately go up as they look to increase the renewal fee, something that I'm afraid is likely in the imminent future. And so for quite a small cost, they could give something really memorable and really powerful back to the community. Think about the way on YouTube people often advertise their silver play buttons. It is quite useful still in this day and age to have something tactile, something physical, and I think that's something that Nintendo could develop from this. Okay, other properties that could have the challenge approach. I don't think all properties actually suit this very well. In fact, I think Donkey Kong is relatively rare. You need a gameplay that suits challenge, where the whole theme of the property is around challenge. You need a decent amount of Nintendo Switch Online games to make that worthwhile as well, which probably puts the newer properties out, Pikmin, at the moment. Obviously, in due course, we probably will get Pikmin 1 plus 2 on the GameCube, but since they're selling them separately, I doubt those are a priority. Animal Crossing, of course, is not going to fit very well, and nor will Splatoon as it is currently. Now, they also need it to have enough games that people will be encouraged to buy the games, but not so many games that it becomes almost impossible to collect all of them. If you did a Mario challenge and you used all however many dozens of Mario games there are on the Switch, that's not going to be a very compelling thing for most people, because instantly people will look at it and go, well, I can never get all of these games, I can never get all these cards, what's the point of having a collector mindset towards it? The great thing about Bonanza is that there is one major game, and there are a number of Nintendo Switch Online titles as well, plus they can do things around the edges to promote the Donkey Kong Country games on the Switch. We also need to consider the funnel direction. So a sales funnel means that you are taking people from one place and directing them towards a particular purchase. Now, the question here is, what is the purchase at the end of the line? Either they are being taken from Nintendo Switch Online towards an external purchase, which is the scenario that I've outlined so far, but there is another possibility, which is that you grab the attention of people who are interested in a particular property and draw them into Nintendo Switch Online. And again, they may well have data about which kind of property audiences are not as invested in Nintendo Switch Online. My guess is that people like Fire Emblem fans might not quite see the same need to be as invested in Nintendo Switch Online compared to perhaps Animal Crossing, where there are obvious benefits to the online service in terms of the availability of DLC and the need to use those online functionalities. So the other properties where I think that there is a good call for a challenge style approach. If you want to funnel people into the games, well, obviously Star Fox, Metroid, Kirby, and to some degree Pikmin, but probably not yet, given that there are currently not any Nintendo Switch Online Pikmin games. There are, however, a small number of Switch titles, and incorporating these challenges as a benefit of the expansion pass is something that you could imagine Nintendo doing. Star Fox does seem particularly well suited for it, and I think of all of these, this is the most likely shot. Metroid is trickier because it is so focused outside the West. If they did want to make a big push on getting Japanese people into Metroid, this could be a way to do it, but it will be really interesting to see how they would tackle that. If they get the sense that the Donkey Kong challenge has actually been quite successful in Japan, then this might be a way to push people into Metroid, but maybe they'll want to get the challenge rhythm up a bit more. Maybe they'll want to really refine this, because it's going to be a tricky thing to get people to move over, having had many failed attempts. Other M did relatively well in Japan, as I understand, compared to most Metroid titles, but it still did pretty poorly. They are yet to have something like Donkey Kong Bonanza, where they have really managed to crack both markets. The other option is Kirby, but I think the fact that Kirby is with HAL Laboratory means that they probably will be less keen to push this. It could be something that is around the anniversary next year, as HAL often make quite a big fuss of Kirby around the anniversaries, and of course it is a huge property in Japan, but the immediate benefits to Nintendo are not quite as clear as the properties where they own single-handedly and outright. If they wanted to funnel people to Nintendo Switch Online, of course, well, Zelda and Mario are going to be the key ones. Anything that's got a big movie, where you're going to have lots and lots of casual people who might want to enjoy an ongoing challenge of this nature. You could imagine before a cinema trailer something being advertised like this, where people get to experience in bite-sized chunks games from their childhood, and so I particularly think there is an option for Zelda. I'd say of these on the screen, Star Fox and Zelda are probably the ones which have the most immediate utility, but in completely different ways. So in terms of forecasting, I think it's almost certain that there will be another remix or feature using classic games by the end of 2029, so I'm going to put that at 90%. I think it's pretty likely that there'll be another use of collectible e-cards, like with the Super Mario Galaxy film and the Donkey Kong Challenge by the end of 2027, whether or not they use this in a link to a challenge. It seems like that technology is something that they are playing with and quite enjoying. I think Metroid, Star Fox or Kirby for the Nintendo Switch Online challenge by the end of 2027 is quite possible. I'd also say there is a chance for Zelda, but I'm not sure it's quite significant enough to put down in this forecast at the current time. I might come back to this around the 40th anniversary predictions. At any rate, that is enough for this video. Thank you so much for watching. Please do consider checking out the Patreon, and I shall look forward to seeing you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.